Listeners, are you ready for your monthly literary adventure? We now have the BFF Book Club. Join us each month to explore a new book. After reading, connect with fellow book lovers and meet the author in a live interview. Can't make it live? Don't worry. We'll send you the recording. You can find all the upcoming book club selections at www.bookishflights.com/read/BFF book club. Hi, I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, we have not only one guest, but two. I am chatting with Heather Taylor and Hilary NUSSBAUM. Together they wrote Know Your Newlywed, which is a full cast audio production starring Mary Mauser of Cobra Kai and Tyler Posey of Teen Wolf. Heather writes and directs TV, film, and audio projects about complicated family relationships. She strives to destigmatize mental illness, disabilities, and poverty in her work. Hilary is a writer, director, and producer. Her background is in television development. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes,
thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, I love to start our show with telling us a little bit about who you are, because I feel like we are so much more than these bios. So would one of you like to take it away?
I'll kick it off because you said my name first, so I should talk first, I guess. So I'm Heather Taylor. I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So I'm far from home now. And I actually started writing when I lived in England. So I lived in Canada, then I moved to England, and then I moved to the US. So I started off in theater and poetry, and I do spoken word. And I kind of fell in love with audio when I was doing theater, and we would perform things live on radio. And there's tons of radio plays. And so that's how I kind of got excited about that and being able to tell your own story. And then that kind of escalated to working in film and working in television and bouncing around to multiple countries. But that's kind of a little bit about me.
I love that. We have a very nomadic life as well, as I know I mentioned before we got on the call. So we do a lot of moving ourselves, and it's not often you meet people that do the same. So how about you, Hilary?
Yeah, I'm Hilary. I'm the other co-author of Know Your Newlywed. And as you mentioned, my background is in unscripted television. So I used to work for a production company that was known for its game shows and formats. And so I would create new ideas and package them as pitches and pitch them to major cable networks. And before that, I was a theater kid. I did plays all through middle school, high school, and was always reading and writing as a child.
Yeah. So did that give you quite the background to write Know Your Newlywed then with your background in television?
Yeah, it really cranked up the pressure. We had to have a game show that I would be proud to stand behind and that I would have pitched. We really wanted to make it realistic and make it feel like something that you could see on the air.
Yeah. Well, for listeners that maybe haven't read Know Your Newlywed yet, would one of you tell them about it?
Yeah. So it's a fun, flirty rom-com about two superfans of an old game show called Know Your Newlywed, and these two fans, Cleo and Javi, meet on a dating app and they have some fun banter, but they live in different cities. Cleo had swiped when she was traveling, and so that was how they matched. And so they don't ever expect anything to happen between them until they find out that this game show is getting rebooted. And then they get this wild idea to pretend to be married so that they can compete together. And then, of course, being a rom-com, feelings develop, and I think you can imagine what kinds of things happen next.
Yeah. And so I think what's really cool about this, which you'll probably have the question about, is that it's a full cast audio drama. So it's audio only. And it means that, while it kind of adheres to some of the classic romance book conventions, like it has dual POV and fake dating trope, but there's no narration. So you don't ever hear what they're feeling on the inside, only what they say on the outside. And so every character is voiced by an actor. There's lots of sound effects to bring the story to life. And then we also got to work with Elena Armas, which was so exciting. She was our executive producer, and she really just really helped us bring it to life. And then this was our first book in this space. So we were just so super excited to work with her. And then we got a lot of what made me excited was we got a starred review from the book list, which I didn't know what that was. So I went on Reddit. What is this? And I've really been even more excited. And then Audible listed us as one of the best romance audiobooks of 2024. So that was super cool.
Yeah, that sounds just like this little, star-crossed journey of this book for you guys. And talk to us, because I haven't ever had guests on that have done just like a full audio cast but tell us about that process and writing a book that's for the ear versus for the eye.
Yeah. So for us, we've worked in audio podcasts, narrative podcasts. So we did a project together called Anomaly, and it was at Tribeca. But when you're looking at something like a narrative podcast, there's a lot more intercutting and a lot more, it's just kind of a different way of telling story. And so when we're looking at creating an audiobook, we had to think about, well, what would a traditional audiobook listener want to hear? Well, then also bringing in a full cast. And so it was like slight tweaking, but really fun because characters got to have much more banter. Because in film and television, you're get in as late as you can, get out as early as you can. And that's the way that we think. And then we're no, you can actually they can talk for a bit. And I'm like, this is really nice. This is good banter.
Yeah, it was really fun to have that space. And then there were a lot of things that we found surprising but challenging. So, as you mentioned, you're not writing for the eye, you're writing for the ear. And so we're used to thinking really visually and how can we tell this story in image and, put more story in our limited time. And here we were thinking about audio, and it's really difficult to write a romance that you can't see the glances and you can't see the looks on their faces. And there was one moment where we wanted to have them hug. And we were like, well, that's just like a rustling sound. How will anyone know what's happening? And so we had to come up with creative ways to convey those moments to the audience and also make that attraction clear and make it clear that they were really into each other, and you couldn't just have them brush up against each other
or even what they look like, because at one point we never said who they look like, and that was a note we got oh, you have to readers want to know what they look like, so we had to, I'm well, they can't just be hi, I'm Javi, I have dark hair. Weird. So we had to be oh, she's your type. I know how you love women with dark hair or whatever. So we had to make it part of what seemed like natural conversation when really we're trying to figure out how do we help the reader really see these characters.
Yeah, I feel like that just adds so many layers to what is already a challenging process, right? Of writing a book is already challenging, but then adding all of those components of, it's not going to be seen on the page and it's got to be heard through story. And then you had mentioned earlier, Heather, about not getting the internal dialogue of the character per se.
Yeah. And there are some audiobooks that are kind of melding those two things together, which I think is really interesting. We were really let's try it full cast. Let's just see how we can play with this. And it really was such fun to do, but also just it is just really challenging your brain to think of a way of how do I create this story that it lasts a long time. And the expectation, the listener's going to listen for, it's 5 hours long.
Yeah.
And unless you do it on twice speed, but it's 5 hours long. So it's how do we make sure that you really can stay with the story for that length of time? And I think there is, it's just interesting, in seeing how people react, and also people being surprised, I've never heard of this type of story before, and then falling in love with it, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah. So for, I'm thinking of the other authors that have been on the show. Obviously, they write the story, and then the audiobook production is the secondary phase of this. But did you write this all and then kind of thought of it in the production phase, or how did that process work?
No, this was entirely designed for audio. So we had the idea and we pitched it to Simon and Schuster, and when they decided to move forward with it, we then further developed the idea and wrote the script. So every moment of plot or character development was conceived with audio in mind. We knew this was going to be something that we would not see and that we would just hear. And so that really influenced the structure and the moments and the locations and all of that. We think a lot about how can we orient the audience in space when they can't see. So how can we create these like sound environments that we could come back to and people will know where they are. And so the studio where they're filming the show sounds a specific way. And, we have them on the street. We have street sounds to orient people. And so it's all really created for audio.
Yeah. So you mentioned you obviously had the narrative style podcast as well. And I obviously don't host a narrative style podcast, but is it similar?
No, it is the same where it's like fully cast. And when we did Anomaly, we brought everyone into the studio. And so we would have people acting together just like you would for what they did this. And then just kind of we created a soundscape behind it. I've had the opportunity to work on another narrative podcast with a creator called James Kim, who is amazing. If you want the narrative audio podcast, like he is brilliant. And I did an episode, but we recorded it on location. So all of the sounds came from where we were. So it's like there is such a wide range of how people create like these worlds. And so mine was on a beach and it was supposed to be February, but it was August. So August in LA is hot. And so the poor actress was pregnant with twins. And so I'm like, please let me know at any point when we need to take breaks because I don't want you to pass out with like 5 mics on you. But it's just like, I think there is, it was kind of a similar process for us, I think, in writing it and creating a world, except it's like we did it for a limited time. Like we did it for like a singular episode. So like a 13-minute thing. But then when we got to Know Your Newlywed, we really had to think about like, well, a bigger story. And it was like writing a television series, like writing a whole season of a television series. And that's how we thought of it. But then you're like, this is what people will consume in really a short time. So it's like binging, except it is the whole thing.
Yeah, I definitely binged it in like a day and a half, listeners. So it was fantastic. And for the Chicago family and friends on the show, there's lots of Chicago references and places they visit because one of the cities is Chicago. So I think you'll enjoy that piece. So, well, what did you guys learn about yourselves through writing this book?
This was a tricky question. I learned that I say 100% a lot because we go through the dialogue a lot and revise, and I kept having to delete it. And I was like, why does this keep appearing? I don't think it's Heather. I think it's me. So I think there were a lot of verbal quirks that came through that I noticed when you're writing something that long. By the time you get to chapter 6, you've forgotten what phrases you've used in chapter 1. And then when you go back and revise, you realize. And so that was eye-opening for me.
Have you noticed that you say it in real life? You know how it's like once you have that awareness, you have this saying. Have you noticed you do it in real life as well?
Yes, I have noticed.
How about you, Heather?
I think for me, it was more a solidifying of how great it is to work with a partner. And I think it's like we work really well together. We bring different strengths to our writing, but I think it's just sometimes you can feel very alone in your writing. And to be able to know that I'm like, I can write this and I don't have to be 100% perfect, but I know I have someone there to make sure that it's really good, and vice versa. I think like to have that person, and also when you're stuck, you're like, especially I'm like, how do we do this part? Like, and then there's someone else to talk to, and it's just, and we're both invested in it, and it's our story together, and we bring different parts of ourselves into it, and so it's really nice to have the parts of me and the parts of Hillary like become this one thing, and that's for me just reiterating to myself like how wonderful it is to have that partnership.
Yeah.
Well, that's a much more touching and thoughtful answer than mine. But I completely agree. And some of my favorite parts of the process are when we're talking through difficult character moments. And, if it had just been me, maybe I would have went with the first or second idea. But because we're talking through things, we're pushing each other to think bigger and be more creative and not just settle for that first idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Beauty and collaboration. I like it. So, how did the casting come about then? Like, how does that phase come in?
So what you do when you send over everything to the production team. So our producer was Allison Light. She was fantastic. And she also directed the actors. And so what happens is you go, okay, here are the types of people that we think this voice should sound like. So you list out actors, and these could be like anyone, like huge Hollywood actors, whatever. It doesn't matter. You're
like a big dream sheet.
Dream sheet. Yeah. It's like now I will say that Javi was Tyler Posey on our dream sheet that we sent over.
Wow.
And I know. We were
That's
like
amazing.
And so we were very excited. And then they also, for like some of the secondary characters, they start to send us like, okay, you hear that sound. Here are some actresses and actors and narrators that have this sound. And then it allowed us to go through. And so we could be part of the casting process. And then they would bring like a long list of like, so it wasn't just Tyler Posey, it was like a long list of like, here are 5 people we'll go to them one at a time. So we were very active in part of that process. And then they would do the reach out to the actors to see who would be interested and who had that time to do it. And so that's kind of how the process works. And sometimes people aren't available, and that's just how it is, or aren't interested, which is how casting goes as well. And I think it was just wonderful because there were actually lots of picks that we never thought of that were like, actually, that would be a perfect person. And then when Mary Mauser came about, we were like, yeah, like she's like them together was fantastic. So we're so happy that we got the cast that we got.
Yeah, I saw a couple clips on audio or on Instagram with reels, right? And just kind of seeing them doing it and the kind of the back and forth. And those were so cool to see that piece of the production.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty magical. I'm going to say it's pretty magical because they're not all in the same room. They're recording sometimes, and they're recording, and they'll sometimes bring different actor combinations together to perform at the same time, but they're not together. So it's just like the fact that you can get something so wonderful and perhaps and so charismatic and just such a great response to each other when they're not together is just kind of very magical. And that's what like you can do in audio. It's just not the same as film and television or anything else. I love that. I love that you're not limited by location. You're not limited by anything. It's just like, can you have a microphone and be in a room that's kind of quiet?
Yeah. And still get an authentic conversation and interaction.
Yeah. I mean, that was what was so mind-blowing to us, is that you hear the connection and you hear the rapport between Tyler and Mary, and you know logically that they're not with each other. But when you're listening, it's really hard to believe. And even Heather and I, when we were listening to cuts, like we knew what happened, but I'm like sitting there staying up way too late because I'm like, I need to hear that moment. I need to know what's happening next. I know what happened, but it was just, they really brought it to life in a new way.
Quite a few authors have mentioned that, of just hearing their story that they spent hours with, right? But hearing it in the audio version brought a whole new level or layer for them to their own story. Like,
yeah. But I think that's what's the beautiful part about like creating worlds, especially as we were creating it for audio, is that it's not complete until those voices come in. Yeah. And I think that is where like they bring their talent. Like we're not performing the voice. We're not voice actors. We're good. We're good at the writing part. And we're like, but that's what completes it. And that's what makes, I think, sometimes the magic, because actors bring their own personal experience. And so we're hearing that in their voices.
Yeah. And like we were saying before, it's the power of collaboration, right? Everyone brings something different and it makes it that much better. And this is just the next layer of collaboration in the process. And it's really cool to see how it develops.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, listeners, go grab a copy of Know Your Newlywed, and it is only in audiobook format, so you can grab that. And I know we have many audiobook listeners here because I talk about them all the time on the show, and just the accessibility of audiobooks and how you can do multitasking and so many other things at the same time. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as readers. So we'll start with you again, Heather, but what type of genres do you enjoy reading?
Okay, I read so many genres. My favorites, what are my favorites? My favorites are romance. And then also on the other side was like, okay, when I grew up, I'd be listening or reading romance because people would leave them in the lobby of my grandma's apartment building. So
Okay.
she'd collect them for me and give them to me. So I was reading romance from like 13. I should not have, but I was. And then I had a library card, and so I was a library kid because we didn't have money to get books. So I would be at the library all the time. And so I would read science fiction and fantasy, and then romance. My favorite romance when I was a teenager was I really loved Regency romance,
Yeah.
and then paranormal romance is my favorite. So
Okay.
magic, witches, I just read them all.
Yeah. And it's still such a big genre today, which is amazing.
Yeah, and they even keep giving more categories to it. It's like Romancy. They just give new names, and I'm like, oh, I read all that stuff. So I love it.
Yeah. How about you, Hillary?
Yeah, I when I started reading, well, not started, probably what I remember reading as a tween and a teenager is historical fiction. I really liked historical fiction. And then I tended more to find an author that I liked and then try to read everything by that author. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily one genre or another. Like my mom sent me a book by Anne Patchett, and I was like, this is great. So then I read everything else that she had
Yeah.
written, like that. I really like romance. I'm reading a lot of contemporary fiction right now. I'm looking at my bookshelf and trying to see.
Do you still read like that? Like you'll dig into someone's backlist? Like once you find an author, you're like, oh, I loved that. And then you'll dig into the backlist?
Yeah, I do because I find that there's a lot going on. I'm really busy. There's a lot of great TV out there. So it's hard for me to read a book that I'm not really engaged in. So once I find an author that I feel that connection with and really feel engaged with, I'll keep going until I've read all of their work, because I know there's a high probability that I will stick with it and like it.
Yeah, I think that makes it such an easy way to go to the library. I've talked about it a lot on the show with because I usually bring my kids to the library, right? And then they're all grabbing books while I'm trying to find the one book I want. And it's like, know your go-to authors. And then you usually, especially if they're very prolific writers, like, you can go find that author on the shelf and maybe grab one that you haven't. Why, your kids aren't demantling or dismantling the library while you're trying to get one book for yourself.
Oh yeah, my kids only recently realized that there is an adult section at the library and it's not just all kids books because we would just go straight to the
Yeah.
children's room and then they wouldn't look anywhere else.
Yeah, mom doesn't have time to go look for books. So, well, how in your busyness do you guys find time to read?
Gosh, Hillary, you want
It's
to go first?
yeah, it's not easy. You really have to make time. I have to say, like, I wanted to read this book. I'm gonna sit down and choose that over TV. But then again, like once I get into it, I make sure to make some time every evening to kind of decompress and
Yeah.
turn off my brain from whatever's going on in my life and kind of immerse myself in some sort of fictional world. So sometimes that's TV and sometimes it's a book. I know you're not supposed to watch TV before you sleep, but I do. But yeah, I think it's just being really intentional about making sure there's, 10, 20, 30 minutes every evening to catch up on something or dive into something.
Yeah.
I read everywhere. And so I will like I like physical books, but I've been doing Kindle Unlimited and library like stuff because it's just easy to get access to books. But
Yeah.
I will read while I'm on the exercise bike in the morning, and I read when I'm eating my breakfast and dinner, and sometimes while I'm watching television, I also read. I will like multitask that way. And then I try to read before I go to sleep so that I have like downtime so my brain can just like not be as activated. But I've always been like that. as a kid, I was worse. Like I'd get in trouble because I would have my book on my lap and I'd be eating, but I'd be looking on my lap. Well, and my mom would be like, no reading at the table. I'm like, who gets in trouble for reading? But it was because I'd also like walk to school and read. Like I'd walk and read because I just couldn't, to me, I'm like, I can't let the story go. I want to find out what happens next. And I was just a voracious reader. And to me, that was like a chance to be in another world. And I just couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking like the ultimate book kid, right? You always had one with you.
Left with books. Like this is not a joke. Like when I was a kid, like when I was like 4, mom would come to bed, into in my bedroom, and I have books stuffed under my pillow, under my arm, and the one on the floor because I'd fallen asleep reading it. Like when I was like really tiny.
Yeah.
As soon as I could read, I couldn't get enough. So that I was always the one where like, Heather, get into the real world. You're too much in the books. But hey, it's really worked for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And now books are part of your world and your life still. And I think that's both of you are saying it's just such a great way to reset yourself for the next day. And I think that's the power of books that we can take away. So you guys have been so gracious to bring a book flight with you today. Can you tell us how you chose these books?
Yeah, we looked at books that spoke to both of us. We wanted to stick with the romance genre because that was the book that we had just written together. And we looked at common tropes and tried to find some themes so that the books in the flight all kind of go together, that there's some commonality between them.
So we picked fake dating. So fake dating is the main, because ours is about, well, fake marriage, but decided to go down the road of fake dating. And so these three are interconnected in that way.
Okay. All right. And what's the first book you brought today?
So we picked, the first book was The Spanish Love Deception by Elena Hermes. She not only worked with us, but we were asked, would you like to work with her? And we love her books. And so we said, of course, but we could not do this book flight without her. So it is a fake dating rom-com about a woman who's desperate for a date to her sister's wedding. Her ex and his new fiance will be there. And since she lied about having an American boyfriend, she needs to show up with one, but it's in 4 weeks. So it's like fun, and it's like having having a really fun character as its lead, working in business and being, kind of not just a quirky character, but one that I'm like, I could totally see as someone who could be my friend. It was so fun, and it was a slow burn. And, I think really Elena is great at really knowing how to keep that tension and really keeping a simmer before she brings things up to a boil. And I think that's what she's really great at.
Yeah. Yeah. Hooks you in the story that way. And I feel like her name is just synonymous with the romance genre. It's like Elena Armas. You're like, yep. Okay. Romance. I know I'm going to get a good book there. So that was The Spanish Love Deception. What's the next book you brought today?
The next book is Funny Story by Emily Henry. So again, fake dating, about Daphne and Miles. So Daphne is engaged, about to be married. Her fiance leaves her for his childhood best friend, who is dating Miles. So both Daphne and Miles find themselves newly single, and Daphne has nowhere to live. So she moves in with Miles and they become roommates. And then when they get invited to the wedding of their exes, Daphne kind of makes this split-second decision to lie and say that she and Miles are dating. And then they pretend to have a relationship. They want to prove to their exes that they're doing okay and they've moved on and things are even better now without them. And I really love the setting. And I think that's actually something that's pretty similar to Know Your Newlywed, where we really create this sense of place in Chicago. Emily Henry really creates this small town of Waning Bay in Michigan, and you really get a sense of the feel of the town and the places that people like to go and how the friends all really come together and support each other. And it's just really nice to kind of experience that setting with the character Daphne, who is relatively new to that location. And then also she's a librarian, which is really fun. So she loves books. She's always reading. She's always thinking about books. She's, reading books to kids. She's a children's librarian. So that was also just a really fun thing to see.
Yeah, I love, like you, Hillary, I love historical fiction, but I think from the learning piece. But if a book also makes me feel like I can learn about a place, I will
Mhm.
instantly love it too, because it's like, okay, I can immerse myself in Michigan or wherever it is, and you feel like you can learn about that place too. So
Yeah.
that was Funny Story by Emily Henry. And then what's the last book you brought today?
The last one is The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. So I discovered Ali Hazelwood because of our editor at Simon and Schuster, because I love science, and I'm like, we have a scientist in our show. She's an Cleo. Cleo is an anthrozoologist, which we thought was a really cool new kind of field of science. And then she's like, "Oh, do you read the STEMinists books?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? What? There's books about STEM?" And she's like, "Yeah, Ali Hazelwood." And I was like, "What?" Okay, so I totally had to read it. And the love hypothesis follows Olive, who's a PhD student who wants to prove to her best friend that she's moved on from this guy that she kind of went on a couple dates with, but her best friend likes. And she's kind of saying that she's dating, but she's not, she's lying. And so she has no way to prove it. So the first man she sees, like in a hallway, she just kisses him. And it turns out to be kind of the most unapproachable and critical professor, Dr. Adam Carlson. So then they decide, she's like, well, I can't let my friend know that I'm not dating someone. And then he's like, well, actually, I have a problem too, because the dean won't give the funding to me that could release because he thinks I'm a flight risk, that I'm gonna go somewhere else with my research. So if I can like prove that I have like roots, then maybe like everything will be fine for me work wise. So they decide to fake date to mutually help each other. And then, things progress from there. And then you start to realize that they actually like have feelings for each other. And it really talks about working in an environment that may be more male focused and what it's like to be a woman in those environments. And also just kind of like, I don't know, I think about learning about your own self-worth too. Like, and I was joking that I read this right when my therapist and I were talking about self-worth and like value. And I was like, it's crying through this. But it just, I really loved it. And it was single narrator. And, I'd worked in environments like Olive did. And I felt like it was or Olivia did. And I felt like it was, or sorry, Olive did. And I felt like it was it just felt so real. And that's what I loved about it, that it felt like real emotionally. It felt real in terms of the workplace and setting. And then also just like, that relationship and coming to be. And I just think like how easy it can be to wrap up your self-worth in your job, but then what it means to
Yes.
someone who can finally see you for you and then do something to protect you, even doing something that could sacrifice things that they wanted. So I just like thought this is great. And now I love Allie Hazelwood for life.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. And I have seen her books everywhere, but I actually have never read it. And now you're like, I'm like, okay, top of the TBR list. I need to read this one. Um, because I think those concepts are so important. And I think we do wrap up in ourselves up in like how much money we make or what kind of job we have or what title we have. And I think it's just such a negative way to think of ourselves. Because the moment that that is taken away, it's like, free fall. Who am I?
But also like how much more can you do? Like you do something like when is it enough, right? Like
Yeah.
if you realize your self-worth is not an external thing, it's an internal thing,
Yeah.
then you will never be able to feel ever worthful enough or valuable enough
Yeah.
because you'll always be looking to do more because how can you ever say it's enough? So
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you find true happiness at that if that's all you're striving for?
that's
So, okay. Well, thank you so much for bringing that one because now I'm like, ooh, so that was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. How I love to end our show here is with just a speed round of questions so you can answer these really quick. Are you a rereader?
No, I
uh,
always want to be, but I don't have time.
Yeah.
yes, but mostly when I was younger, I read all of the Ellen Montgomery books so many times. So it's like if you know Anna Green Gables, that's her, but she has
Yep.
lots of other books too. And then I would reread the Shannara series by Terry Brooks, and then also Lord of the Rings. I read it many times.
Yeah. Love it. And then what is one book you've read that has changed your life?
Okay, so growing up, I said this before, I was a library kid and couldn't afford to buy books. and I love science. And one of my elementary teachers gave me a book called Kitchen Science, and I still have it. And the book made science accessible to someone who didn't have a lot of money. And I didn't need any special equipment. I just needed, for instance, sugar, water on a string, and you can make crystals grow. And so it made me like, it really inspired me. And then I also want to give a mention to Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella. Shoeless Joe became Field of Dreams. And it was surprising for me because it brought together science and magic and history and baseball and most of all, family. There's some father issues in there, and I totally identify. But it showed me that a world of a story can be grounded while also being much more. And it really made me see that magic is everywhere. And it really inspired me to write like I do today.
Yeah. That actually prompted, we got to go to Field of Dreams as a field trip. Like where I grew up, it was within driving distance. So we read Shoeless Joe, and then I got a little field trip to Field of Dreams when I was a kid. And I don't think I've talked about that book since that, but it's obviously, it's lived, rent free in my head that I still remember going there. So how about you, Hillary?
I had a hard time with this one. I looked at my bookshelf and it was sort of like, what book have I had the longest? And there were a few, but the one that stood out to me is The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, which I've carried around since middle school when a middle school English teacher like made us all read it. And it really made me think about the craft of writing and the impact that punctuation and sentence structure and word choice can have on a reader, and how you can use all of those tools to convey an idea or an emotion. And it's something that I'm really conscious of now when I'm writing, particularly when you're writing dialogue. What order do the words come in, and where are the pauses, and how would somebody say something? So I would say that's the book.
So is it a writing craft book then?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. It's like rules of writing, and it's like how to use semicolons, and there are certain word rules for writers. I'm trying to think. One is like use as few words as possible, but they say it much more eloquently. And these are things that I think of every so often.
Yeah. Well, what a great book that your teacher handed you for that.
Yeah.
All right. Where is your favorite place to read?
My favorite place would be a coffee shop with, a fresh mug of hot coffee, but that doesn't happen very often. So really, it's just anywhere I can sit for a few minutes.
It's very idyllic if we get it.
Yeah.
How about you, Heather?
My favorite memory of where I loved reading was lying on the couch. We live in a townhouse for a bit. And lying on the couch when it's really sunny outside and hot, but in Alberta, it's really dry. So the breeze would come in through the screen door, and I would just lie on the couch and read with like the wind kind of coming gently through the house. And it was sunny. And then my favorite place would be to be inside. So that was like that favorite memory of like just a summer day that you had nowhere to be and nowhere to go. And you could just take that time and get engrossed in a story.
Yeah. And I love how it imprinted on your mind like that.
Think about that a lot.
Yeah. Lastly, what are you reading next?
So I'm currently reading, this is not going to be anything that I mentioned earlier, but I'm currently reading memoirs for a personal project that I'm working on.
Okay.
And so I'm halfway through Destination 485, Meeting Your Neighbors One Siren at a Time by Michael Perry.
Okay.
That in Wisconsin. It's about a person who is an ambulance, or he's a firefighter and EMT, and worked as a nurse. And then I'm also then moving on to The Night Shift by Dr. Brian Goldman. It's about his work in the ER.
Okay. Wow. Those sound fascinating.
They're really good. Oh, I mean, excellent. So like read them. It's Michael Perry is like a really interesting writer, really eloquent. So I would recommend reading his stuff.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. And then what about you, Hillary?
Yeah, I'm finishing up Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. I really liked Fleischman is in Trouble, which was the TV series based on her first book. And so I had to pick this one up, along the theme of continuing with an author. So
absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the show with me today. I know your time is precious, and I appreciate all you've given me.
No, thank you. This has been fantastic. It's very rare that I get to talk about my reading. And so I really...
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Heather Taylor and Hillary NUSSBAUM. We'd love to hear what other books you'd pair with your fake dating rom-coms book flight. You can head on over to bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information about today's book flight or other books that we talked about. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Your review not only helps the show, but it also helps the podcast to reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure you will not miss an episode. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.